We're up there working our butts off 10 hours a day because I want everyone in Vegas to know that these guys aren't getting paid.
She's threatening us with harassment, that she's going to have us arrested for harassment because we're trying to collect our money.
Johnson told our Taking Action reporter Jackie Calloway his former boss refuses to pay him for all the hours he'd worked. Jackie?
Well, this St. Petersburg resident is far from alone. We did some checking and found out what happened to Jeff Johnson happens to hundreds of other local workers every year.
Clinical professor Claudia Flores, the director of Global Human Rights, stated, "The labor conditions of incarcerated workers in many U.S. prisons violate the most fundamental human rights to life and dignity."
Prisoners are thrown into jail defenseless from the merciless guards and subject to the injustices of American prisons. They are protected by a set of unenforced guidelines called the Nelson Mandela Rules. This is a reality for the vast majority of prisons across the United States.
Employees outside of jail freely walk with the many rights given to them by the FLSA, a document mainly establishing minimum wage and overtime pay for all employees. Even though prisoners do involuntarily work for extended periods, they lose all the rights outlined in the U.S. law, including minimum wage and overtime, as soon as they step foot in the prison.
American prisons are not upholding their responsibilities towards the prisoners and are depriving them of rights such as adequate living conditions, overtime, minimum wage, and forming unions that normal employees have through the FLSA or that prisoners should have through the Nelson Mandela Rules.
The FLSA, which stands for the Free Labor Standards Act, was passed in 1938 by the U.S. Congress and President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The conversation about wages and working hours gained traction after Roosevelt's re-election in 1936. The Secretary of Labor was assigned the task of creating laws to regulate working hours. Further efforts were needed to enact a more comprehensive law, and in January 1938, a bill that would eventually become the FLSA was presented to Congress. After extensive discussion and voting, the bill was signed into law by President Roosevelt and took effect on October 24, 1938. It is one of the most powerful laws and has improved workers' rights ever since. Before the FLSA, there was a lot of controversy surrounding workers' rights and how many hours they had to work. Many countries, including the United States, signed the International Convention, sponsored by newly formed International Labor Organization. They declared that a 48-hour workweek is standard. From there, the U.S. passed the FLSA to try to further and decrease the number of hours that they declared standard per week, creating the workweek we know today.
Outlined by the FLSA, employees have the formal right to a minimum wage. This dollar amount is always changing, and in 1938, when the bill was originally passed, the wage started off at 25 cents per hour. Back then, this was barely enough to afford anything, but it was better than nothing. This dollar amount slowly started to raise due to inflation, and today the minimum wage in Illinois lies at $15 per hour. But this varies from state to state. An exception to this rule is for tipped employees like waiters. They must receive a minimum of $5 of tips per hour to be eligible to be paid less than the minimum wage. Another right that employees have is the right to overtime pay. Unless exempt, employees covered by the Act must receive overtime pay for hours worked over the 40-hour workweek at a rate no less than half their regular pay. Another benefit of being an employee in modern-day society is because of the HR, or Health and Resource Department. Employees can report anything that is going wrong to this department, and they will be able to deal with their problems. Overall, this creates a safer workplace for everyone. Finally, any employee has the right to join a union. Unions are a large group of employees that fight for each other's rights. They can negotiate on each other's behalves and will fight for better pay and better conditions for all. We interviewed a union leader, Jake Reusner, and here's what he had to say about it.
The biggest crime, the biggest amount of theft in the U.S. is not robbery, it's not stealing cars, it's not home invasion, it's wage theft. Two-thirds of all the theft in this country every year is wage theft, where an employer steals money from their employees. And nobody's going to prison for that.
While all public sector employees have these rights, someone needs to be responsible for holding these up, and this responsibility tends to fall on employers. Employers have the responsibility to manage their employees. Whether it comes to pay and working conditions, employers have the responsibility to uphold all their employees' rights. But if they do not uphold their employees' rights, employees can look to HR or Health and Resource Department to help fight for their rights. They can also look to unions to help fight for their rights. Inside of prisons, these rights are not being upheld, causing inhumane working life.
We also interviewed a currently incarcerated person named Sam Lott. Here's what he had to say about prison wages.
Like what I do, I'm getting paid $18, $19 an hour, right? we're getting paid that same job, $30 a month.
The United Nations has always been concerned about prisoners' well-being and the prison staff's responsibilities. In 1955, union members developed the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. For more than 60 years, these rules were the universally acknowledged standards for managing prison facilities and treating prisoners. They had a tremendous influence on the development of prison laws, policies, and practices across the globe. Since then, this set of rules has been adapted and changed. In 2015, they were given the name Nelson Mandela Rules in honor of a South African president who was imprisoned for 27 years due to his struggle for justice and human rights. The Nelson Mandela Rules are the backbone of prisons' responsibilities towards inmates. Without these rules, the treatment of prisoners, work, and their overall living conditions would be significantly worse. For example, prisons must give their prisoners light, ventilation, temperature, and access to open air and physical exercise. These are a few of the many rules that fall under the category of living conditions. However, prisons frequently do not follow these guidelines.
Although the Nelson Mandela Rules define the responsibilities that prisons supposedly hold to inmates, these rules are not properly enforced, and the inmates are forced to do many unreasonable tasks without receiving just compensation. We are not saying that prisons should treat inmates like royalty, as that will not teach them anything about the consequences of their negative actions. However, it is unreasonable to deprive them of the most basic human rights. According to a study conducted by the University of Chicago Law School, 64% of incarcerated workers surveyed report worrying about their safety while working. Prison labor should not frighten the majority of inmates unless the work they are doing is over-intensive or they are forced to work in poor conditions, which should not be the case.
Another concern for inmates is that incarcerated people are commonly beaten, stabbed, assaulted, and killed in facilities run by corrupt officials who abuse their power with impunity. These actions prove how U.S. prisons are depriving inmates of basic human rights. Prisons are meant to care for prisoners. However, these wrongdoings show how prisons are doing the exact opposite of that.
Also, a few states do not pay prisoners at all for the majority of this work, and even the states that do only give between 15 and 52 cents per hour. However, this is partially due to the underfunding of the criminal justice system. Think from the perspective of prisons. They are not given enough money to properly house and feed hundreds of prisoners. Prison systems have to scrape by with the little money they are given and use it to care for inmates and provide a salary to guards and wardens. The inmates are required to be fed, clothed, given medical attention, have a basic education, be engaged in physical fitness, and much more. Overall, this leads to poor living conditions and most inmates being disregarded.
All in all, prisoners are being treated unfairly compared to everyday employees. Although it may feel like this has no impact on citizens like you, these prisoners who lived in a dehumanized community for years are leaving full of rage and returning to be your neighbors.
A study by the United States Department of Justice reads, more than 650,000 ex-offenders are released from prison every year, and studies show that approximately 2/3 will likely be rearrested within 3 years of release.
When prisoners leave jail, they do not have any money because of the pennies they're being paid in prison. This forces them to continue their wrongdoings, leading to a cycle of crime. Even though they've done negative things in society to end up there, they're still humans, just like the rest of us. Inmates need to receive adequate pay in prison so that they can break the cycle of crime. Never forget, prisoners are people too.
In California prison, after years of reported sexual abuse against incarcerated women by prison guards.
Now, women talk about, the living conditions, what it looks like to walk in your own waste.
Plans to close Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill and Logan Correctional Center in
Logan yes. So what is it like to have everything and then not have freedom?